stay-at-home measures enforced to control the spread of COVID-19 in 2020 correlates with an alarming increase in the incidence of domestic violence and child abuse for the same period. Whereas the Tobago House of Assembly Act 40 of 1996, via the Fifth Schedule, is responsible for all matters related to social welfare on the island, the Minority Leader, Kelvon Morris, will lay a motion which will mandate the Tobago House of Assembly to develop and implement strategies to treat with the meaningful engagement of both victims and perpetrators of these incidents. Tomorrow, Thursday, May 26th at 1:30 p.m., you can either come in or tune in for the 6th sitting of the 2021 to 2025 session of the Tobago House of Assembly. Either way, don't miss it.
so that peace and happiness, truth and justice may be enjoyed by all people. Grant this for the sake of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. You may have your seats.
Oath of allegiance of a new member. Announcements by the presiding officer.
Honorable members, leave request to be absent from today's sitting was submitted by Assemblyman Natasha Charles Pantin. The leave is granted.
Assembly bills sent back from Cabinet. Assembly laws brought back from Parliament. Petitions, papers.
Chief Secretary and Secretary of Finance, Trade and the Economy. Leader of Assembly Business.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. Chief Secretary is not in the House at this time. May his request be deferred until he is in the House. Thank you.
Request for deferral has been granted.
Presentation of reports from Dispute Resolution Commission, select committees, questions to secretaries, questions for oral answers.
Minority Leader. And before we start, Minority Leader, can I have your attention? This House starts at 1:30, and I will caution each member, every member, to please abide by the standing orders. This would not be tolerated again. Thank you.
Of Infrastructure, Quarries and Urban Development.
Secretary for Infrastructure, Quarries and Urban Development.
Good afternoon, Madam Presiding Officer. Good afternoon, members. As always, it's an honor to be able to speak in this August House. Madam Presiding Officer, I have read this question several times in order to try to understand what the question is asking. I suppose that I have failed, because it could not be that the member was asking what seems to me to be a rhetorical question. He represents an organization that has tremendous experience in setting up boards and understanding what the roles and functions of board members are, to come to this House today to ask this question. So I had intended to give a long forward, Madam Presiding Officer, but I've decided to answer the question as it is written. If there's a difference in the rules, absolutely there is a difference in the rules. If there's a difference in the functions, absolutely there's a difference in the functions. And absolutely, there's a difference in the remuneration of all independent directors and of the executive directors appointed to the board at Stolly Park Quarry.
We're not done with you. Can the secretary please indicate what are those differences in function, in roles, and in remuneration? Thank you.
Madam Presiding Officer, I beg your leave to state that I would need to research the answers to that question, and I'll return at the next sit-in to answer that question, those questions.
Minority Councillor.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. Question number 9 to the Secretary of Food, Security, Natural Resources and the Environment and Sustainable Development. With respect to the employment in the division,
Minority Councillor, Standing Orders 26 indicates that you don't need to read the question. Assemblyman Mr. Tate, Assistant Secretary for Food Security, Natural Resources, the Environment and Sustainable Development.
Pleasant good afternoon, Madam Presiding Officer, Deputy Chief Secretary, all assemblymen, councillors, those who seated in the House, those viewing, good afternoon again. Thank you for the opportunity to respond, Madam Presiding Officer. The Secretary is aware that the division will recruit persons as sees fit to execute the mandate of the division. This is nothing unusual, and the technical staff continue to express the need for recruitment of staff over time. As a matter of fact, given the very important mandate of food security, the environmental protection, the division will, in the near future, create industries across the Tobago landscape, which will open up further employment opportunities for all. The Secretary is willing to work with everyone, including you, the minority leader, to ensure that employment opportunities through the industry creation could be provided for the development of Tobago and all Tobagonians. Thank you.
Madam Presiding Officer, can the Assistant Secretary outline the process used to engage the daily rated workers?
I prefer to defer all other questions until my Secretary is available to respond.
Question has been deferred.
Thank
Minority Leader.
Thank you.
Question number 10 to the Secretary of Health, Wellness and Social Protection.
Secretary for Health.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. In the month of April, at the Roxborough Health Facility, we had 7 new patients who were seen via the gynecological clinic, OBGYN. We had 2 new general medicine patients. For May, we had 39 OBGYN and 16 medicine. Thank you.
Minority Leader.
With respect to renal, urology, and the other services that weren't mentioned, is it that, do you have the figures for those?
The figures that I have provided are the figures available.
What's that?
Secretary.
The figures that I provided are the figures that are available.
Is it that persons went to access those services and were unable to access those services?
Secretary?
The process that is used to admit new patients into the outpatient clinic at the Roxborough Health Facility is one that is based on referrals either from the health centers in the district or from individuals who live in the area who currently attend clinics in the Scarborough district. Every person who has been referred to the Roxborough Health Facility thus far has been seen by the professionals in their respective fields.
Secretary confirmed that on the staffing organization, we currently have renal staff to provide renal services, urology, and the others that weren't mentioned.
Madam Presiding Officer, I will answer. It is important for us to recognize that this administration came into office in December 2021, when in fact this Roxborough Health Facility was commissioned and was opened over a year ago. I am sure we all remember that the Prime Minister came up to an opening, and since then, we have not been able to provide renal services at the facility. The leadership of the Tobago Regional Health Authority is continually managing the recruitment of specialist physicians in Tobago. We've been here for close to 6 months. The dialysis team that has been recruited for the Roxborough Health Facility have been undergoing training over the last couple weeks. They are now ready, given that the dialysis machines are brand new and the technology associated with the dialysis machines were actually brand new. They are now ready to start accepting patients that are referred from the dialysis center at the Bacalet Health Center to Roxborough from next week. We have been working to ensure that the transition of specialist patients is done in a seamless manner. As a result, there are policies that are currently being developed that speaks to the implementation, that speaks to the actual functioning of each of these specialist clinics at the Roxborough Health Facility. My time, Madam Presiding Officer, indicates that even though there was a huge opening for this facility years ago, this process is now happening because the process has begun. A medical chief of staff was hired late last year to start managing the hospital process. Pediatricians will be available at the Roxborough facility from June 1st, and those referrals are being set up as we speak. Patients from the eastern communities who have been attending specialist outpatient clinics have currently been transferred, and they will start seeing nephrology and internal medicine from next week. The required health professionals to facilitate them being seen appropriately will be available at the facility from that time.
Minority Leader, again, your persistence precedes you. I think that the Secretary have answered all the questions. Any further questions, you can get it in writing from the Secretary of the Division. Let's proceed. Next question, Minority Leader.
Question number 11 to the Secretary of Tourism, Culture, Antiquities and Transportation.
Councillor, Secretary of Tourism, Culture, Antiquities and Transportation.
Madam Presiding Officer, thank you. Members, good afternoon. I take note of the Minority Leader's persistence this afternoon in asking follow-up questions. So I hope that at the end of my answer, he is satisfied in his mind that I have answered him. As it relates to the recommencement of direct international flights to the A&R Robinson International Airport, there are 2 airlines operating for the period January to April 2022. British Airways recommenced operations on 10th January and Virgin Atlantic on 29th January 2022. For the period January to April 2022, there were a total of 2,392 passenger arrivals to Tobago, which represented an 80.8% decline in international passenger arrivals from the total of 12,445 for the same period in 2019. So please permit me to read into the record the breakdown by month. So in January 2019, we had 3,129 passengers. In 2022, we had 400. February, we had 3,689 passengers. For 2022, we had 832. For March, we had 3,215 passengers. For March 2022, we had 610. In April 2019, we had 2,416 passengers. In 2022, we had 550. British Airways was responsible for 80.1% of arrivals from January to April 2022, with 1,916 passengers. However, when compared for the same period in 2019, there was a 44.5% decline in arrivals from 3,450. Virgin Atlantic was responsible for 19.3% of arrivals from January to April 2022, with 462 passengers arriving on the airline. However, when compared to the same period in 2019, there was a 76.5% decline in arrivals from a total of 1,968. So I will now read the breakdown by airline. In January 2019, British Airways brought in 680 passengers. In 2022, they brought in 390. In February 2019, 1,053. 2022, February, 598. March 2019, 927 passengers. 2022, 455. In April 2019, they brought in 790 passengers. And in 2022, 473. It must be noted that there's a vast difference in the time periods, as the former period of 2019 was pre-COVID, while the comparative period for 2022 are the immediate recovery months after our borders were closed for nearly 2 years. During the January to April 2019 period, Tobago was also directly serviced by Condor, Sunwing, and Caribbean Airlines, while Thomas Cook operated from January to March 2019. It is also instructive to note that during the period March 2020 to December 2021, when this administration took office, marketing spend for the destination continued in spite of the fact that our borders were closed and we were unable to receive any international flights or passengers. the then board of directors of the tourism agency, a board that both members of the minority council served on during the period 2018 to 2021, continued to rubber stamp the payment of marketing fees to international agencies for the entire period of lockdown. In the last year alone, total marketing spend was close to 8 million TT dollars. Numbers do not lie. And it's clear to me as secretary that we are not presently seeing return on investments, and these investments were done by the previous administration. It is actually disheartening to know that these flights that are currently operating out of the UK are leaving almost on a weekly basis filled to capacity, and the majority of passengers disembark in Antigua and Barbados. However, these marketing arrangements are currently being reviewed by the new board, ably led by Ms. Alicia Edwards, who I'm certain will ensure that, one, Tobago sees an increase in direct airlift from international destinations, with a resultant increase in international passenger arrivals to Tobago. Two, a review of our current contractual arrangements with these airlines is done to ensure that we are receiving value for money. And three, that we review and revamp our marketing efforts across all current and new source markets to ensure that brand Tobago receives the attention that it deserves, and we can begin to solidly position ourselves in the minds of travelers as the greatest little island on the planet. Madam Presiding Officer, I thank you.
Follow-up question. Councillor admitted that in 2019, while I served as a director, our arrivals were 80% higher than it is as of today. And I would want to find out from the councillor, how will we get to the 100,000 passengers that you would have indicated that you want to have by the end of the year? How will we get to that 100,000?
Councillor.
Madam Presiding Officer, the minority leader has introduced a new question at this time, and we are still building out the division of tourism because when I assumed office in December, we had no technical staff and we did not have a strategic plan. So the mandate that has been given to me by the Chief Secretary was to increase our visitor arrivals. We are doing that at this time by building out our capacity within the division and creating a strategic plan that will also encompass all of our stakeholders who will be part of ensuring that we can get to that figure in the shortest possible time. Thank you.
Minority Councillor.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. Question number 12 to the Secretary of Health, Wellness and Social Protection.
Secretary of Health, Wellness and Social Protection.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. The new Tobago Regional Health Authority Board will be announced in a couple of weeks.
Follow-up, Madam Presiding Officer, to the Secretary. As it relates to decisions that currently require the approval of the Board of Directors of the TRHA, can the Secretary indicate what process is currently being used for those approvals?
Certainly. As you recognize, there is now a CEO of the TRHA that has a spending limit. When the spending limit is reached, the administrator of the Division of Health, Wellness and Social Protection is able to sign off. If that spending limit is reached, the chief administrator is able to sign off.
Minority Councillor.
Question number 13 to the Secretary of Education, Research and Technology.
Secretary for Education, Research and Technology.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. Good afternoon, colleagues. The question was, given that the country is still experiencing a COVID-19 pandemic and face-to-face school has resumed, does the division have a COVID-19 policy to manage the physical reopening of schools? Yes, we do. The Division of Education, Research and Technology has developed an infectious disease management plan, the first of its kind in the country for COVID-19. This plan outlines a systematic approach to prepare for and respond to any such infections and any related situation or activity that warrants a careful and prudent response. This IDMP for COVID-19 in schools details the strategies to manage a flexible, scalable, and proportionate system response with appropriate and timely interventions and allocation of resources to minimize the health consequences in all schools on the island of Tobago. The IDMP was established on March 23, 2022, with its latest revision occurring on the 23rd of May, 2022. All principals have been provided with a copy of the policy and are provided with updates whenever revisions are made. The dynamism and uncertainty of the virus, coupled with the changes in the national policy, mean that there would be constant changes. In response, we will monitor operations within our schools and make further modifications to the policy based on emerging needs. The Minority Council is free to have this copy. Thank you.
From the policy, what is the process or procedure?
Minority Councillor, can you speak up, please? I'm not hearing you.
Can the secretary indicate, based on the policy, what is the procedure to deal with teachers as well as students who would have contracted COVID?
What is the procedure to?
To deal with students as well as teachers who would have contracted COVID-19 and is required to be.
Minority Councillor, this question was not placed on the order paper, and as I previously indicated, this copy will be provided to you. You are free to gain the information from the version I have in front of me. I will bring it to you now. Thank you.
Clerk?
Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Assembly on definite matters of urgent public importance. Statements by secretaries or assistant secretaries. Personal explanations. Introduction of bills. Motions relating to the business or sittings of the Assembly and moved by secretaries or assistant secretary. Public business. Private business. Motion.
Can I just remind members, when you are finished speaking, to turn off your mics, please? Thanks. Minority Leader, please be reminded that you have 40 minutes of speaking time to move the motion and 30 minutes of speaking time to wrap up at the end of the debate. To other members presented, you are given a speaking time of 30 minutes and 10 additional minutes if requested by another member on your behalf. Minority Leader, you may now begin.
I beg to move the motion instead of the Minority Leader.
Repeat.
I am requesting to move the motion instead of the Minority Leader.
Minority Councillor.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer, for the opportunity to move this motion this afternoon. And the motion reads, whereas the Tobago House of Assembly Act 40 of 1996, via the 5th schedule, is responsible for all matters related to social welfare. And whereas the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 resulted in stay-at-home measures, and whereas there has been an alarming increase in incidents of domestic violence and child abuse, directly affecting men, women, and children, be it resolved that this House joins in condemnation of these heinous acts of violence and abuse meted out to our citizens throughout the country. And be it further resolved that this House mandates the Tobago House of Assembly to develop and implement strategies to treat with the meaningful engagement of both citizens and perpetrators of these incidents. And Madam Presiding Officer, in my contribution today, I will highlight global and local statistics and reports that indicates and shows the alarming increase in incidents of domestic violence and child abuse. I would also identify some recommendations to treat with the meaningful engagement of victims and perpetrators, after which I will conclude. Madam Presiding Officer, this issue at hand is a very complex one in nature. And as the Prime Minister pointed out recently, we are historically a violent society arising from our history of colonialism and slavery. But before I get into the meat of the matter, so to speak, I crave your indulgence as I deal with the preamble of this motion. And as stated in the motion, in keeping with the Tobago House of Assembly Act 40 of 1996, under the 5th schedule, social welfare is listed as item number 26 on the areas of responsibility of the Assembly. And as such, there is a department dealing with social welfare in the Division of Health, Wellness, and Social Protection, which is geared towards meeting the needs of the elderly, disabled, and disadvantaged to strengthen their economic and social well-beings. Victims of domestic violence and child abuse can be considered disadvantaged. And COVID-19 has become commonplace, and individuals are learning to deal, to cope, and to adapt to this new normal. At the onset of this dreaded disease, governments worldwide implemented stay-at-home measures to combat the spread of the virus. And similarly, in Trinidad and Tobago, our government implemented the Public Health Ordinance, Chapter 12, Number 4, which indicates that all non-essential workers shall remain at home until such time as indicated. These restrictions resulted in closures of schools, bars, recreational facilities, and of course the suspension of non-essential services both in the private and public sectors. These stay-at-home measures also resulted in individuals being locked down with their abusers, creating dangerous conditions for violence against women, men, and children, often with tragic consequences. There may have been a school of thought that the pandemic and the stay-at-home measures would bring partners and families closer together. However, global indicators tell a different story. And the UN Women Report, measuring the shadow pandemic, violence against women during COVID-19, confirms the severity of the problem and has revealed gender-based violence has increased significantly as a result of COVID-19, and domestic violence has increased globally in 2020 and 2021, leading to the United Nations to label this as a shadow pandemic. And this report, Madam Presiding Officer, brings together data collected in 13 countries across all regions. and it reveals the following. Firstly, the pandemic has increased women's experiences of violence and eroded their feelings of safety. And across the 13 countries surveyed, 2 in 3 women report that they or a woman they know has experienced violence at some point in their life. Nearly 1 in 2, or 45%, reported direct or indirect experiences of violence since the start of the pandemic. And the report also broke down the different types of abuse experienced, the most common form being verbal abuse, which accounted for 50%, followed by sexual harassment, 40%, physical abuse, 36%, and denial of basic needs, as well as denial of means of communication, being 35% and 30% respectively. And Madam Presiding Officer, prior to COVID, these are some things that we took for granted. The report also indicated that most women believe that COVID has made things worse in relation to domestic violence. So nearly 7 in 10 women think domestic violence has increased during the pandemic, and 3 in 5 think sexual harassment in public has also increased. In many cases, heightened demand for shelters and other forms of support has remained unmet due to operational constraints. And Madam Presiding Officer, the study found that COVID-19 has eroded women's feelings of safety, whether inside or outside of their households, with significant negative impacts on their mental and emotional well-being. Socioeconomic stressors such as financial pressure, employment, food security, and family relations stood out as having a significant impact not only on experiences of safety or violence, but also on women's well-being overall. In other words, Madam Presiding Officer, violence against women has had a significant impact on women's mental health during the pandemic, and socioeconomic factors play a major role in women's experiences of violence. 1 in 4 women, or 23%, said that COVID-19 has made things worse in terms of how safe they feel at home, and among women whose partners has no earnings, 4 in 5 report that they or a woman they know has experienced at least one form of violence. And finally, Madam Presiding Officer, the report also indicated that age is no barrier when it comes to violence against women. And the findings revealed that age doesn't offer much protection. Women over 60 experience violence at similar rates to younger women, with over half reporting that they or a woman they know has experienced some form of violence. And we are seeing a similar situation here at home in Trinidad and Tobago. And Madam Presiding Officer, this report is very instructive and it is informative also. And I would encourage members to take a read. So I would have outlined the global statistics, and now I want to share a local view on this matter. And Madam Presiding Officer, in an article entitled "A Perspective of Intimate Partner Violence Since COVID-19," and intimate partner violence is sometimes referred to as domestic violence, since a large number of these acts are committed by perpetrators occur in the homes or in the households. And this article was written by Ravid Khan and Saria David from the Department of Paraclinical Services, University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago. And they have stated, and I quote, "The advent of the COVID-19 pandemic saw the introduction of many unprecedented actions occurring within our communities and by extension our country. Whilst many of us may have heard the term pandemic before, few would have had the knowledge or experience of the measures that were taken to contain coronavirus in our country. The introduction of lockdown measures, such as the closure of public spaces like bars, restaurants, malls, places of worship, and the list went on, as well as the stay-at-home orders like working from home for non-essential persons and the closure of all schools were just a few of the measures that were put in place to curb the spread of the COVID-19. And the article goes on, the ramifications of these measures would pan out over time, with some becoming apparent earlier than others, and with grave consequences, particularly an increase in acts of intimate partner violence, or what we also call domestic violence. And the article quotes, locally in Trinidad and Tobago, prevalence rates as high as 41% have been reported, with alcohol and drug abuse being cited as the leading cause. And according to the August 2020 report from the Trinidad and Tobago Central Registry of Domestic Violence, in 2019, there were 232 reports of domestic violence. Compared to 2020, there were 556 cases of domestic violence that were reported, and we are seeing a significant increase, more than double the amount. And during the period of January to March 2021, there were 826 reported cases of domestic violence. And Madam Presiding Officer, based on these findings, it would appear that COVID-19 created a conducive environment for domestic violence surge, with the background of an existing high prevalence rate, compounded by confinement and possible increased consumption of alcohol and drugs at home. And of course, the article went on to indicate some societal factors that we may have accounted for the increase in violence. And Madam Presiding Officer, while preparing for this presentation, it was quite interesting to see the number of commentators, researchers, and the professionals globally as well as locally agreeing that stay-at-home measures which fight against the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in alarming increase in domestic violence. And as we see this demonstrated, there's another article that was captioned, "Stay-at-Home Orders, accompanied by a rise in domestic violence in Trinidad and Tobago." And the comments of this article is attributed to the former Commissioner of Police, Gary Griffith, who was speaking at the launch of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Services Gender-Based Violence Unit on January 21, 2020. And the article reads, in a press conference on April 9, 2020, the country's Commissioner of Police, Captain Gary Griffith, shared data confirming that such crimes have been on the rise, and he's speaking to domestic violence crimes. In February 2019, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service has received 39 reports of assaults by beating. In February 2020, the figure had climbed to 73. Similarly, in March 2019, reports on domestic violence numbered 42, while in March 2020, there were 96 reports. And Gary, in the report, stated a rise in domestic violence cases from 232 in 2019 to 558 in 2020. And from the reports, we obviously see an alarming trend of the increase in domestic violence. And Madam Presiding Officer, although we were not able to obtain data specific to Tobago in relation to domestic violence crimes, the minority held several meetings and discussions with NGOs and individuals who assist domestic violence victims. And they also noted the overwhelming increase in persons seeking support and seeking help from their organizations as a result of domestic violence. And not only have we observed an increase in domestic violence, there has also been reports of a stark surge in crimes against children and adolescents. And various theories explain the social isolation measures taken by governments worldwide, the impacts on jobs, the economic instability, high levels of tensions, and fear of the virus as other factors, as well as other factors which have accounted for the increased levels of stress in families and therefore greater risk of violence. And the reports from the Trinidad and the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago reported 4,142 cases of child abuse across Trinidad and Tobago in the year 2021. And for the first quarter of 2022, January to March, the Children's Authority has already seen 1,030 cases of child abuse across the country. And as it relates to Tobago, between 2021 and 2022, reported cases of child abuse in Tobago have accounted for close to 4% of the total reported cases across Trinidad and Tobago. And based on the overall statistics, this means that there were more than 150 cases of child abuse reported in the year 2021 in Tobago. And approximately 40 cases have already been reported for the first 3 months in 2022. And this is January to March in Tobago. And Madam Presiding Officer, during the Child Abuse Prevention Month in April 2022, the Children's Authority highlighted that across Trinidad and Tobago, child sexual abuse remains a major concern and is the second highest category of abuse reported to the authority, accounting for just over 23% of the reported cases. And it is important to note that these statistics are based only on the cases reported to the authority. Many cases of child abuse and also domestic violence would have gone undetected if persons fail to make a report. So we are encouraging as well persons that if they know, if they see, make a report. And Madam Presiding Officer, one incident of domestic violence or child abuse or any crime for that matter of fact is one too many. And we call on the Executive Council and the members opposite to join with the minority in condemning these heinous acts against our citizens. It is anticipated that members on the majority would pontificate that the PNM was in office for over 20 years, why didn't address this issue, and so forth and so forth. And yes, the former administration would have implemented policies and measures to address these issues. And it was under the People's National Administration that various social welfare grants and assistance were implemented that mirrors most of those social support offered by the central government, example, the rental assistance, and there are many more assistance and grants provided. A committee was also set up geared towards streamlining children care and the foster care facilities and establishing standard operating procedures, SOPs, to manage and supervise the operations of these homes compliant with the Children's Authority regulations. It is our information that this committee would have created a policy document and guide for foster care and children's homes on the island. And Madam Presiding Officer, there are also a number of other initiatives to strengthen the support to these institutions on the island, among other initiatives. And notwithstanding, Madam Presiding Officer, the COVID-19 pandemic has exaggerated and intensified incidents of domestic violence and child abuse. The research speaks for itself and shows that this is not only a Trinidad and Tobago issue, it is not only a Tobago issue, but a global challenge which we must face head-on. Dynamic, forward-thinking, innovative, sustainable solutions are required now.
Minority Councillor. Minority Leader, this motion was brought in your name. Can you please explain why you didn't do your presentation first to move your motion?
This was in terms of it was to be in the name of the minority councillor. However, it was written under the hand of the office of the minority leader.
Clerk.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer.
Minority Councillor, please hold. Clerk. Minority Councillor and Minority Leader, I caution you all to get your correspondences correct when coming to the business of the House. The motion is in the Minority Councillor's name. Yes?
Yes,
You may
Madam
proceed.
Presiding. Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. And I was indicating, Madam Presiding Officer, that dynamic, forward-thinking, innovative, sustainable solutions are required immediately, right now, to address these issues. And this minority, as we highlight and identify the issues, we also put forward recommendations to address them. I am pleased to indicate that most of the recommendations today came from our consultations with organizations and individuals who support these victims. And the first recommendation I wish to place on the table for consideration is the review of existing policies to ensure that they are applicable and address the issues currently facing our island in relation to domestic violence and child abuse. COVID presented new realities and highlighted existing ones, and therefore existing policies may require adjustment. Additionally, it may also require implementing new and innovative policies for the medium term as well as the long term. Another recommendation that we wish to put forward is greater collaboration, strengthened partnerships, and increased resources for NGOs supporting victims of domestic violence and child abuse to facilitate added access to shelters and provide increased social support to victims. In our meetings with the stakeholders, it was highlighted that a number of victims returned to the perpetrators because they simply have nowhere else to go and therefore seemingly have no other option than to stay in the situation of abuse. And this was quite alarming. Our third recommendation is improved or greater public awareness campaigns in an effort to reduce and end domestic violence and child abuse. And finally, we also want to recommend the support for the perpetrators. And if we wish to reduce or end domestic violence and child abuse, support should not only be provided to victims, but also to the perpetrators. It is said that domestic violence is learned behavior. And because it is learned behavior, it can also be unlearned. There are numerous stories where current perpetrators were past victims or were a part of families where domestic violence or child abuse occurred. And then we also have some of our traditional beliefs of spare the rod and spoil the child, or if the man does not beat the woman, he does not love her, as illustrated by a calypso from one of our famous calypsonians. And these are just a few examples of learned behaviors, and therefore the minority advocates for intervention and support for the perpetrators that provides appropriate measures to hold them accountable for their abusive behaviors and choices, that addresses the root causes and belief systems which contribute to the violent behaviors, as well as challenges them to recognize and adjust their abusive behaviors and attitudes with the goal of preventing violence in their current and future relationships. Madam Presiding Officer, the minority believes that this is a multi-pronged approach. A multi-pronged approach, should be used where the Tobago House of Assembly facilitates the partnership of all sectors, government or the public sector, business sector, as well as civil society, such as NGOs, and includes support for both victims and perpetrators that is of a preventative as well as protective in nature. And in conclusion, Madam Presiding Officer, this minority is willing to work with the Executive Council to address these and other issues and seek the support of those opposite for this motion. And I will reread the motion. And whereas the Tobago House of Assembly Act 40 of 1996 via the 5th schedule is responsible for all matters related to social welfare, and whereas the onset of COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 resulted in stay-at-home measures, and whereas there has been an alarming increase in incidents of domestic violence and child abuse directly affecting men, women, and children, be it resolved that this House joins in condemnation of these heinous acts of violence and abuse meted out to citizens throughout the country. And be it further resolved that this House mandates the Tobago House of Assembly to develop and implement strategies to treat with the meaningful engagement of both victims and perpetrators of these incidents. Madam Presiding Officer, I beg to move.
Madam Presiding Officer, I beg to move to second this motion.
Members, the question proposed is, whereas the Tobago House of Assembly Act 40 of 1996 via the 5th schedule is responsible for all matters related to social welfare, and whereas the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 resulted in stay-at-home measures, and whereas there has been an alarming increase in incidents of domestic violence and child abuse directly affecting men and women and children, Be it resolved that this House joins in condemnation of these heinous acts of violence and abuse meted out to citizens throughout the country. And be it further resolved that this House mandates the Tobago House of Assembly to develop and implement strategies to treat with the meaningful engagement of both victims and perpetrators of these incidents. Assemblyman Sonny Craig, you may now join the debate.
President, good afternoon, Madam Presiding Officer, and to all of the majority and minority in the House. President, good afternoon. The minority has brought to us this evening a motion which I'll read. States, whereas the Tobago House of Assembly, Act 40 of 1996, via the 5th schedule, is responsible for all matters related to social welfare, and whereas the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 resulted in stay-at-home measures, and whereas there has been an alarming increase in incidents of domestic violence and child abuse directly affecting men, women, and children, be it resolved that this House joins in condemnation of these heinous acts of violence and abuse meted out to citizens throughout the country. And be it further resolved that this House mandates the Tobago House of Assembly to develop and implement strategies to treat with the meaningful engagement of both victims and perpetrators of these incidents. Let me tell this House this afternoon that this motion is late, is very late, because as I sit as Assistant Secretary for Health, Wellness, and Social Protection, I could say beyond a shadow of a doubt that we have been working assiduously to deal with this situation in our beloved island of Tobago. The goodly councillor stated statistics from far and wide, and I don't think it would be of any consequence for me to seek to state also. There is no challenge to the fact that domestic violence constitutes something very heinous and very, very harmful to our society. We at the division have been meeting and interacting with persons in our community continuously for the 5 months that we have been in office. And during those 5 months, of course, they came just at the tail end of the pandemic. We have been able to see where some negligence on the part of those that were before us could be part of the reason for some of these challenges we have in our society. You see, the research on domestic violence would show that most of the perpetrators in domestic violence happen to be men. And when your island suffers a certain kind of leadership, it could filter down right into the society and create a certain measure of frustration. Nonetheless, we at the division are well equipped and seeking to continually improve the quality of service we offer to those who are so affected, both victims and perpetrators. It's part of the structure of governance in Trinidad and Tobago to have proceedings and court hearings from time to time to deal with matters of this kind. And so for domestic violence, We have a family, district, and children court to deal with matters as they arise. The judicial officers are present, and their probation officers to prepare a probation officer's report in order to guide the decision-making process. Parties in proceedings can be adults, children. Risk assessment reports have been requested as far back as 2021 as well, so that we could do a better job as we go forward. We request counseling. We have therapy, mediation services, probation services. All these are done in Trinidad, but in Tobago, the model is a bit different because we have internal referrals where our social workers and social support staff could meet those affected and deal with their different challenges. A supervision order can be made in which an officer is required to monitor a child in need of care and protection. So the children are specially taken care of. We have judicial officers, judges, masters, and magistrates, or magistrates. They can request investigative reports at any time, and that involves the abuse of a child. And this can be done at any point in the proceedings. Both clients and victims can benefit from interventions and support through counseling, monitoring, rehabilitation through probation, supervision orders, referrals to other stakeholders to assist in their overall well-being, example in treatment and substance abuse. So the motion as presented to us today borders on pretense that nothing is in place. Because if I read it again, it would say, the House mandates the THA, Tobago House of Assembly, to develop and implement strategies. There is something developed already, and there are already strategies in place. The strategies also involve assistance to the perpetrators. We know that once the perpetrators are not dealt with, there is a risk of repeat offense from time to time. Upon request of the court, supervision orders are carried out, clients are monitored, and are referred to counseling. Anger management and drug treatment are also offered. Perpetrators are also exposed to workshops, training, programs for behavioral changes, such as thinking for a change, remedial therapy, case care management. All this is guided by an act, the Domestic Violence Act number 27 of 1999. So this afternoon, we could safely say that the motion presented is flawed, and that as an institution, the Tobago House of Assembly, we stand ready to just improve on what we already have in place to work for the betterment of our citizens. During the pandemic, which lasted 2 years, persons who were so prone and so inclined were involved in many of these heinous behaviors, but it's not something brand new to our environment and to our society. Domestic violence has been around for a very long time. And so it's our endeavor, we intend to do our endeavor best to seek to work with our citizenry, to work with our professionals, to ensure that this scourge is brought under subjection. Despite officers being trained in general counseling, there's a need for specialized training in the area of domestic violence. This was specific to Trinidad, as the officers there provide counseling while we refer to, all right, my apologies, sorry. Recommendation for an assessment tool to deal with the varying types of applicants, that is spouses, siblings, parents, parent-child, etc. This would assist in the implementation of more precise programs and recommendations to deal with recidivism. This was made particularly since the Tobago District Court began requesting risk assessment reports in 2021. Multi-agency forums, agencies working together to assist victims and perpetrators of domestic violence, sharing information and plans, how they intend to deal with families taking into account the ongoing risk associated with COVID-19. We have social workers who are hesitant to enter homes and do in-depth investigations, and these areas present our greatest challenges. A standard database to capture necessary, pertinent information for easy storage, retrieval of information, and for use by the CSO, the Central Statistical Office. And of course, attention to be given to particular training in assessment and counseling clients with domestic violence issues and matters before the court. What I'm saying in a nutshell is that regardless of what the situation presented is by this motion, the Tobago House of Assembly and the Division of Health, Wellness and Social Protection is well equipped and seeking to arm itself continually to be able to deal with this ongoing threat. Under the leadership of our Chief Secretary and our Divisional Secretary and Associate Secretaries, we intend to continue to pilot the way towards dealing with this scourge in our society. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Minority Leader, you may now join the debate.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. It's indeed a pleasure once more to join this debate in what I would describe as a most relevant and necessary discussion in Tobago at this time. Let me also congratulate Minority Councillor, Mrs. Petal Daniel Benoit, for tabling this motion today, because given what we have been seeing playing out in the public space over the last month or so, where we are seeing a number of reports dealing with child abuse and child care, and of course we continue to see the challenges that we as a nation are facing when it comes to domestic violence. This tells me this is a minority council that is well in touch and well in line with what really matters to the people, not just of Tobago, but of Trinidad and Tobago, and I wish to congratulate my colleague. Madam Presiding Officer, my colleague from Boku would have indicated that this motion, he described it as late, and he seemed to suggest that it's irrelevant. And it tells me how out of touch this current administration is with what is really going on with our people here in Tobago. It tells me this gentleman is willing to call things or call the weather sunny when it is indeed raining. Because this issue of domestic violence, this issue of child abuse is alive and well in our homes, in many homes, real in Tobago at this time. And therefore, we found it very critical that we bring this motion to the attention of the Tobago House of Assembly so that we can have rational discussions. We can have meaningful discussions as to how we address this issue, this scourge that is plaguing our island. And I don't know who the Assistant Secretary would have consulted with, but when you talk to the NGOs, when you talk to the stakeholders, the people who are providing care to persons, to victims, and the persons who are providing care in the Children's Authority and those other stakeholders, you would recognize how grave a situation we have on our hands at this time. So to dismiss this issue as irrelevant and as late and we have it under control, we don't have it under control, sir. This issue is one that requires more than simply policies. This issue is one that requires more than simply us playing lip service, us marching up and down the road. It requires us to get together as a people, get all the persons who are willing to make a difference. We need to get back into the schools. We need to get into the churches. We need to get into the communities. And it means that we need to refashion and rebrand. And we need to treat with our young men and our young girls. And we need to treat with our families. And we need to treat with our homes. And we need to treat with our Tobago people to ensure that violence is something we eradicate in this island, on this island. Madam Presiding Officer, it is in this context we brought this motion, because when you look at various reports, in fact, there was a report from Luke TT dated November 25th, 2021. And we have one of the persons, it's Ms. Corby, who is attached to the gender-based violence unit. And she's telling us that domestic violence in the country has reached a point where its incidence has been established as a national concern. Throughout the last 2 years, and with advent of COVID-19, there has been a steady increase in the number of persons provided with support by domestic violence unit. She went as far as to break it down for us, and she said in 2020, over 899 people, these being 649 females, 205 males, were provided with support via the victim and the victim and gender-based unit. While for this year, which was 2021, 858 people were assisted, 669 females and 188 males. And what this tells us is that the issue of domestic violence, the issue of intimate violence, is not only restricted to women. It is a national issue that affects both men as much as it affects women. It tells us that as a society, we need to get into the homes where the issues are live and well. I was speaking to one NGO provider, and in the conversation, I was told that basically there are situations that would happen in the home. So when you have you have broken homes where domestic violence would have been a situation that the children would have experienced. That affects the child. And when that affects the child goes into school. And when that child is faced with incidents of whether it be someone perhaps might bully, might trouble them, they just don't know how to deal with conflict. And we are seeing that issue transcending from the home into the schools. We are seeing fights all over social media, and that tells us that something is wrong. And we need to get the kind of intervention. We need to sit down and understand what is that thing that is wrong and treat with it. And I heard my colleague explain and discuss the kind of systems we already have. And you're speaking to the converted. Because, of course, for the past administration, of course, and Councillor Daniel Benoit mentioned it, would have put some systems, would have put some things in place, but we are not, we recognize that there are gaps. And it is for this reason, while we condemn these acts of violence, while we condemn the acts of the perpetrators, we are saying we must not give up on them. We are saying, let us look at where the gaps lies, and let us see how we can have these issues resolved to the benefit of both the victim as well as the perpetrator. There are situations where, when you look at this whole issue of gender-based violence, and when you look at how we treat with the victims, I know for a fact there are persons who stay in abusive relationship because they just don't know where to turn. They just don't know where to go. They may apply for a grant, they might apply for the rental assistance, but they may just not qualify. And we do not yet have the type of support, the domestic violence shelters and those kind of things. And even if we have them, they are not enough, they are not sufficient to really take in victims of domestic violence. This is one of the things we'd want to posit as something we should do post-haste, is to work with the NGOs, persons like Ms. Mars and they who deal with gender-based violence, and have available or construct, if we can, a shelter specific to persons facing domestic violence. We are saying we have issues with child abuse. There are persons in our system who, for one reason or the other, will perpetrate acts against children that are of the most heinous nature. And we condemn those persons, but we should not leave them in the dark, because it means that most times these persons have some kind of mental challenge that they either suppress, that has been suppressed over a period of time. It is very difficult, and I could share with you because I know of persons who have mental challenges and need to see a therapist. It is very difficult to get that kind of support in a timely basis, even now. So yes, the division may have some therapeutic counselors, but how many are they? And when you look at how long it takes to access the service, sometimes even depending on the case, if you're a child, then you have to go through another, I think it's through the Division of Education and so. And if you are an adult, then you come through the Division of Health, Wellness and Social Protection. And perhaps maybe we look at where we streamline this service under one unit and have resourced in that unit adequate therapeutic counselors so that we can give persons the requisite support. I remember one time in the THA, we did have support for workers, and you could have access very discreetly and confidentially the service of going to a counselor, and you talk about whatever situation, could be domestic, could be on work, and so forth. But at some point, it becomes very costly to the THA, and that service would have had to be removed, I believe. But I'm saying that coming out of this COVID-19 experience, this type of service is needed more than ever, because we have persons under pressure. Imagine, this administration is one that is sending home persons without no kind of support, no separation package, and you're sending home in some cases families, you're sending home husband and you're sending home wife. How you expect these persons to survive? These kind of issues can lead to domestic violence. Because when people are frustrated, when they are unable to provide, this leads to conflict. So you are contributing to domestic violence at this time.
Minority Leader, you're out of order. Please get back to the topic, please, at hand.
We are talking about domestic violence.
Minority Leader, this is my house in case you forgot. Please get back to the topic at hand.
Madam Presiding Officer, I stand guided. Thank you. So, domestic violence. And I recognize that we have to be very guided in how we speak about domestic violence and those reasons and those situations that can foster domestic violence. I would have consulted with an expert in this matter, and we had the discussion very openly, and we are looking at some of the other strategies that can be adopted and some of the things we discussed, because we looked at what are some of the strategies, that we can use in terms of assisting both victims and perpetrators of domestic violence, as well as child abuse. And it is suggested that the strategies adopted must be one of continuous and a continuum of care. And it must focus on the preventative, so your prevention. And it is important that we begin to develop and teach this in our primary school, all the way up. So we are saying that domestic violence and child abuse and those issues, the strategy should involve education and educating persons from as early as the primary schools all the way up to adulthood, so that we can create that environment that would allow persons to appreciate each other, appreciate how you treat with conflict, appreciate how you care for one another, how you relate with one another. And we are positing that this should really have the involvement of our education sector and the schools. We should also look around developing this in the homes, in the families. And we are not just simply saying that let us implement this strategy as a one-size-fits-all. But we are saying it's for us to understand our communities, for us to understand our families, and let us really do things that impact the homes. Let us get into the homes, because there are a lot of broken homes, a lot of broken men and women walking around. And when these broken men and women walk around, it is through these interactions that we end up with issues of violence, where we are losing our women at the hands of violent men, and where we are seeing our young girls especially being abused by some men that I would not want to really describe in this house. And we have some immediate actions that should be necessary when these things occur. We need the swift and immediate actions to be put in place. We need an immediate referral for mental health assessment, and this treatment should come forward, whether it be by the THA or a contracted firm. There should be no wait for all involved, both victim and perpetrators. We also need not to make the issue so much criminal, while we are not taking away from the fact that it is a crime. But we really should adopt a humanistic approach to this issue. We need to seek and understand the question why. Why is this happening? We need to have places, as I mentioned before, have places of safety for both persons should this happen. So we are not just proposing places of safety for the victim, but we also need to look at how we house and how we rehabilitate the perpetrators. And as mentioned before, we also need to have that robust divisional referral without the hassle. In the future, we need to have these programs sustained throughout the island at all levels. So yes, the Division of Health, Wellness and Social Protection should be that initiating frontline department, that frontline division. But at the same time, we really need an all-of-government approach to this situation that is domestic violence and child abuse. And we also ask the question, what are some of those prevailing conditions that foster these incidents of domestic violence and child abuse in our society? And we must admit, and we have to understand that there are horrible people living amongst us. With that being said, we have to understand emotions. We have to understand that there's a lack of willingness to understand people are not property, and therefore, they should not be owned. The way we raise our boys in understanding life and women and relationship is also important. The way we see child protection, we need to really educate persons as to what child protection really means. And we also need to create the relevant child protection system. So as I close, Madam Presiding Officer, I want to reiterate to this Honorable House that this minority, we will continue to look at the issues relevant to the people, because one of the things about this minority is that we believe that whatever we come to this house with should really represent what the people are saying on the ground. And in our walks, you would see us from time to time, all across Tobago, walking and meeting the people. And this issue of domestic violence and child abuse is one that we recognize is very real. In fact, the NGOs are crying out for support, and we will posit to you that we provide the strategies, we provide the systems that can bring support to both the perpetrators and the victims of these incidents as to ensure we have a safe Tobago, we have a Tobago where our children are protected, we have a Tobago where our women are protected, and we have a Tobago that our men feel empowered. I thank you.
Secretary for Health, Wellness and Social Protection.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. I must admit that when I saw this motion, I thought that it was a decent attempt by the minority to right some of the wrongs that have been plaguing our system. And by system, I mean the official system, since we're talking about the Tobago House of Assembly over the last couple decades. I smiled because the first resolution is very much one that I think we can all agree to. Violence is not something that we should allow to happen. And yes, we should all condemn violence in all forms. So I thought that that was good. When I read the second the resolution, Madam Presiding Officer, I became a little concerned for several reasons. And some of those reasons do include the fact, as the minority councillor did state in the opening remarks, that many of the deficiencies that we are seeing in the system now are actually there because the processes and because the policies and because all of those things that are necessary to make it work are not in place. And the reality is that the group of individuals who had the responsibility to put them in place is the same organization that the Minority Council belongs to. It is a fact that the last 2 years of COVID has caused all of us to be a little battered and bruised. Some of us really a lot more than others. Those of us who were blessed enough to continue being employed, we felt probably a little less harsh response to what was going on. But the last 2 years really has been difficult for a lot of Tobagonians. It is important to recognize, though, that, and I will say it again, because maybe we need to remind people that Rome was not built in a day. We need to remind Tobagonians that we really have just been here for under 6 months. We need to remind Tobagonians that the system that we have met has been the system in place for the last 21 years. So we need to be realistic. I would like to ask the minority councillor to probably indicate to the minority leader that the words of my colleague, Mr. Sonny Craig, they were very clear. He indicated that the motion was a little late. I don't think, and I could be wrong, that he indicated that it was irrelevant. So it is inaccurate to try to state that my colleague is saying something that is so heinous is irrelevant. He did indicate that it was late for very good reasons that it was late. It is late. Now let's go back to one of the things that I continually speak about is the fact that when we are to fix a problem, it is absolutely critical for us to understand the cause of the problem before we can suggest solutions. I indicated in a program a couple weeks ago that we in Trinidad and Tobago need to stop being reactive to things happening. And we need to take very clear and decisive decisions about how we as individuals respond and how we as individuals breed this kind of culture that has caused us to be so violent. How exactly do we treat with our young boys and our young girls? Let's just think about it. We very frequently say to a little 3-year-old girl who has fallen and bruised her knee and is crying, we run to her, we hug her, we kiss the boo-boo. You know, we show kindness and compassion and those things to our young girls. But a 3-year-old boy who has fallen and who has hurt himself and is crying, many of us say to him, "Stop crying. You're behaving like a girl. What are you crying for?" And at that moment, you are actually telling this 3-year-old child who is hurt, who is feeling pain, that the pain and the hurt that I am now feeling does not matter, and that I am not allowed to express that hurt and that pain. And then we become surprised when that 3-year-old boy is now 20, 25, 30, and does not know how to express hurt and pain in a way that is not violent. You have to ask yourself, what are we doing to culture our boys and our girls? Another quick example. The fact that when that little boy cries, you say to him, "You are behaving like a girl." The fact that every single time a male does something and you are trying to insult him, you compare him to a woman, in and of itself is saying that you think that women are less than, you think that women are not equals. Because if an insult is to call a little boy a little girl, you're behaving like a girl, that is an insult. You in yourself have accepted the fact that boys and girls are not equal. And I ask you to think about the reverse. Will you ever say to a little girl, in your hope of trying to punish, that they are behaving like a boy? We don't do that. It is only in the reverse where we say you are behaving like a girl. A couple weeks ago, I did a program, Madam Presiding Officer, in the East. I am continually called to do programs as it relates to safer sex and safer sexuality with our young people. And I did this program with several different groups, and I asked them several questions. I asked, if a 30-year-old man has sex with a 13-year-old girl, is that wrong? And in 2 or 3 of the groups, they all say, yes, that is obviously wrong. A big hardback man having sex with a 13-year-old girl, that is obviously wrong. And I asked the same question. If a 30-year-old woman has sex with a 13-year-old boy, is that wrong? And in every single group, they said, that is okay. She bringing him up. She giving him experience. And these are young people who have already begun to accept that there is this imbalance among the genders. I also, and this is the last example I'll give to show that we need to be very conscious when we are standing here and saying these things. We need to be very conscious of what we actually do. I asked that same group, talking about sexual harassment, which I am so happy you brought up, Minority Councillor. We asked in those same groups, what happens when a bunch of fellas on the corner passing and a young girl pass? You know, the typical, they always able to say, psst, dark thing, sweetness, shorty, you're looking good. They all recognize that that was how we respond. And Madam Presiding Officer, I asked the girls in the group, do you like it when young fellas do that? They all very quickly shouted, no. Madam Presiding Officer, what happened after that is what I am really coming to. What happened after that was the young men in those groups started saying, but all you like it, all you accustomed to it, and all you just be wearing these short clothes and what we to call all you and ting, 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 ting. They automatically start pushing back. And then I asked the young girls again the same question. I asked them, I said, girls, do you all like it when the young men do that? And the first time they answered, they all screamed, no, we don't like it. The second time I asked the question after the young men started pushing back, they all then said, not really. Some were very silent. Because, Madam Presiding Officer, they had recognized at that point that their no did not mean anything, and that their no was pushed back on, and that their no did not have value. Now, I say all of this, Madam Presiding Officer, to indicate that as much as we want to just get up and give fancy speeches and that kind of stuff, there is some very deep-seated work that we as Trinbagonians, we as Tobagonians need to do within our own families, within our own circles, to help treat with this issue of domestic violence. Let me segue a little bit into what is happening at the Division of Health, Wellness and Social Protection. When we saw this motion, I quickly ran to some of my social workers again, who, by the way, one of the reasons they are unable to respond as quickly as they should is because the unit is heavily understaffed, which was one of the reasons, one of the things we did recently was send out notices for more social workers and therapeutic counselors and so forth to be hired. Because as much as we are asking them to do the work, we need to also support them by ensuring that their workload is not too much for them to bear. They are still only human beings. So I asked them, given that this is the motion that I am expected to debate on, can you tell me what is in place now? What is in place? What have you been doing? What has been going on? Where has this been going? Talk to me. And one of the first things they said to me was, Dr. Faith, we had a whole program that we was planning to do. We had a whole proposal that included going into our communities and chatting with the youths and chatting with the older people and chatting with the boys versus chatting with the girls and whatnot, whatnot. We had all of those, and then they pulled out the proposals that were dated years ago. And then I said to them, what happened? And the response was, those above did not think that it was a priority. All they wanted us to do was to give out the food cards and to give out the equipment and to give that kind of stuff. They did not put priority in these things because they would not have been able to show. We had a 400 and something food card in my back pocket. So it is kind of very annoying to have the Minority Council come here today and talk about the fact that the social workers and the therapeutic counselors and so forth, that they are not doing enough when they have been trying. And it is your colleagues who did not give them the support to do what they needed to do. I join my colleague, Assemblyman Sonny Craig, in saying the motion is late. Let me also indicate that we have the audacity to come here and stand up and talk about the fact that we do not have a shelter for women who are in domestic violence situations. When I was at the Division of Health Wellness, and it was Health and Social Services back then, I to tell you how long it was. One of the things that was implemented then was WeTech, Women Empowerment Technology Center. And that place was a place where women, it was a shelter that women were supposed to be able to go to, women and their children were supposed to go to when they are in need. I showed up at the Division of Now Health, Wellness and Social Protection and asked, where is that shelter? And the answer is they're ducking their head and saying, well, those who were in charge did not see it as a priority, so it fizzled away. And then I had to ask them. I understand because when I was in the Minority Council, there was talk about a building that was purchased for some millions of dollars that we were supposed to use to house children, to house possibly women, all of that. We spent millions of dollars on that property. A couple weeks ago, I went with my staff to view the property. And I left almost in tears because the whole thing have cracks all over it. And when they look at it, when my PIU looks at it, they say, Dr. Faith, we can't use that building at all. That building is not safe. The amount of work we would have to put in to make that building safe, it then makes sense trying to rehabilitate that building. That building was purchased within the last couple of years, during the period where the organization that you all represent right now were the ones who took taxpayers' money. And purchased that building that we now cannot use because it was, well, I don't even know what was the rationale for spending the money. But we are here now, and we are in a position where we cannot use it. My social support staff, what they are currently doing, because we just looked at the Auditor General report again, and as soon as I saw the Auditor General report, I actually said to my administrator, let us sit down let us sit down right now to figure out what we need to put in place, because anytime the auditors come to look at this tenure, I do not want my good name associated with any of those adverse reports. So we sat down and we realized that several things need to happen. We need to have very good policies in place. We need to figure out how we can actually provide swift support in a way that actually makes sense, in a way that actually fulfills the Auditor General and fulfills the financial regulations and those things, without having to boast that we have a 400 and something food card in our back pocket. My social workers, my social support staff, they've been tasked with coming up with that policy so that we know when we say left, right, up, down, it is because that is the policy and we are going to follow it. Some of the programs that were not agreed to includes dealing with anger management, includes parental classes, includes substance abuse prevention, includes life skill training, includes giving out more money for the REACH grant and so forth, which is a business development grant. Those were the programs that was written in that proposal that I looked at, and those were the programs that they said to me were not a priority. So don't come. Sorry. Don't come today and try to pretend you are doing something when, yes, I will say it, you had the opportunity, your organization had the opportunity to do it and did not do it over the last umpteen years. Talking about perpetrators, we actually were supposed to have a graduation within the prison system this week. Because again, my social support staff went out of their way and actually implemented a full prison program where the prisoners were learning about, dealing with their anger and dealing with their emotions and how we could resolve these issues so that when they go back into the system, they go back better. When representatives from the prison system actually met with me, they actually said, Dr. Faith, we were so excited about this because we are actually seeing the results. We are actually seeing that some of our charges are now in a better position than when they were before. So the programs are there. What we need is the kind of leadership that actually prioritizes those kinds of programs so that the support staff, the social support staff that are doing the best that they can throughout the various divisions, not just mine, can do their work. Now, I am very, very happy, and I'm wrapping up. I am very, 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 very happy that the minority leader also spoke about the fact that one of the problems we have is that if you have a client who is a child, the child needs to be seen by education people, and while the adults need to be seen by Division of Health, Wellness, and Social Support people. Because what he is in fact speaking about is the reason we brought the motion that we brought last month to the House, to have a case conferencing model in place so that all of these social support people can actually work together on their cases. That policy will be done by the end of June. And as a matter of fact, my social support people are telling me that even though the policy is not done yet, they have already started doing it, where depending on the case, they are already sitting in a single room, not necessarily physically, but they are already sitting in the same room with the social workers from different arms of the THA, ensuring that the kind of service we provide to our clients is absolutely the best kind of service. Up until today, this morning, as a matter of fact, I was in a meeting with UN Women, because UN Women are looking at various models of ensuring that our cities, of ensuring that our communities are,
Member, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. This meeting with UN Women this morning was part of us partnering to ensure that we use tried and true and tested models to develop the kinds of systems that we are talking about. We are continuing to provide the kind of leadership, to provide the kind of support to our social support staff that is necessary. Before I wrap up, I would like to actually give two numbers that have been in place at the Division of Health, Wellness, and Social Protection. And these numbers, one is for therapeutic counselors, because we actually have a decent cadre of counselors on board. They are an amazing bunch of people who know what they're talking about and know what to do. If you are in a situation where you need therapeutic counseling, you can call or WhatsApp 683-8341, 683-8341. If you need an assessment, social support intervention, you can call or WhatsApp 683-8347. Yes, those are both numbers that I met while here. But we are ensuring that the individuals who answer those calls are totally supported in their job. And because of that, Madam Presiding Officer, we are recommending that we do, in fact, indeed, support an amended version of this motion. We will go with, whereas the Tobago House of Assembly Act 40 of 1996, via the fifth schedule, is responsible for all matters relating to social welfare. And whereas the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 resulted in stay-at-home measures, and whereas there has been an alarming increase in incidents of domestic violence and child abuse directly affecting men, women, and children, we will even go with, be it resolved that this House joins in condemnation of these heinous acts of violence and abuse meted out to citizens throughout the country. But we will amend the motion to change the last resolution to, instead of read that this House mandates the Tobago House of Assembly to develop and implement strategies to treat with the meaningful engagement of both victims and perpetrators. We then have it read, be it further resolved that this THA Executive Council continue to support the work of our social support staff within the Tobago House of Assembly and the larger Tobago community, including NGOs, CBOs, in managing these issues. With that, Madam Presiding Officer, I beg to move.
Honorable members, the question is that the motion be amended by deleting the last resolution that reads, be it further resolved that this House mandates the Tobago House of Assembly to develop and implement strategies to treat with meaningful engagement of both victims and perpetrators of these incidents. And inserting the words, be it further resolved that this THA Executive Council continue to support the work of our social support staff within the Tobago House of Assembly and the larger Tobago community, including NGOs and CBOs, in managing these issues. Members taking part in this debate hereafter may speak on the original motion and the proposed amendment. Minority Councillor, you may wrap up this debate.
Madam Presiding Officer, thank you again for the opportunity to wind up this debate. And first, I want to say that I am happy that those opposed to the minority would have agreed to some aspects of the motion. We, however, don't see the relevance of amending and the version that is currently placed for the amendment. And we are also happy that you agreed that the former administration would have implemented and put in place policies to address this issue. And the Secretary of Health Wellness in her wind-up would have indicated the good work of the persons who are providing services for mental health issues and counseling and so forth, and the hotline that is now available to persons seeking immediate intervention in relation to domestic violence and abuse. And we agree that there is a need to culture our children differently, and that is one of the reasons why under the former administration, the current Division of Health, Wellness and Social Protection was named Health, Wellness and Family Development, because we saw the need to empower and engender and boost the whole issue of family life, because we understand that everyone has a role and a responsibility to play in the upbringing, and we all have a part to play in contributing to the reduction. But we are also saying that the Tobago House of Assembly and this Executive Council has a major role in facilitating and bringing all sectors together to the table to forward and implement these strategies. What I think the majority did not understand in our motion is that we agree, and the statistics both presented by myself and everyone who would have presented statistics here, the statistics shows that domestic violence and child abuse is prevalent in our society. But we see the motion currently as timely and relevant because there has been a significant rise. And based on the statistics, it's more than twofold in some instances in domestic violence and child abuse. So we understand that current policies are in place. But what we do not feel is that the current policies addresses the need sufficiently. We do not feel that the current policies address the significant rise, the exaggerated rise in domestic violence and child abuse. And we feel that this administration needs to pay closer attention and deal with those issues that present itself as a result of COVID. So pre-COVID, yes, we had domestic violence, but we are seeing now an exaggerated rise. And of course, we are seeing in Trinidad and Tobago, where, was it last week? Almost every day of the week, there was a murder, death, a woman, child, children. And we feel this is something urgent that the administration needs to pay attention to. And it cannot be business as usual. Madam Presiding Officer, we also want to place on the record, or correct the record rather. It was indicated that the minority agreed that policies were not in place. The minority did not agree or did not indicate or did not suggest by our utterances that nothing was in place to deal with domestic violence and child abuse from the last administration. And Madam Presiding Officer, I would not go much longer, but in the research and the readings, we would have seen, and based on the discussions with NGOs, individuals, and I'm happy that we would have engaged in those discussions. So we have a greater appreciation and a full understanding of what is happening in relation to these issues. And one of the things that were identified is that the potential for economic abuse, which leads and increases domestic abuse and child abuse, one of the resulting factors was due to job losses, furlongs, reduced working hours, and a general decline in economic activity. And we would have seen that in Trinidad and Tobago, because of the lockdown and the stay-at-home measures, persons were forced to go home. And again, it was indicated that this was one of the reasons, job losses was one of the reasons or one of the factors that accounted for increased stress levels and increase in domestic violence and abuse. And Madam Presiding Officer, I want to caution this current administration as they dismantle departments and they dismantle and send home persons, that the manner in which they are doing the restructuring and disengaging and disenfranchising persons, that they are not contributing to the increase in domestic violence and child abuse. Madam Presiding Officer, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to contribute in this debate, and I thank you.
Honorable members, amendments were proposed to the motion before the question is put to the House. We need to vote on each amendment. The amendment proposed was that we delete the last resolution and be it further resolved that this House mandates the Tobago House of Assembly to develop and implement strategies to treat with the meaningful engagement of both victims and perpetrators of these incidents, and to insert and be it further resolved that this Tobago House of Assembly Executive Council continue to support the work of our social support staff within the THA and the larger Tobago community, including NGOs and CBOs, in managing these issues. All in favor, say aye. Any against? The ayes have it. Amendment is carried. Now, members, I would now put the question to the House, given all amendments were carried. The new amended motion reads as follows. Whereas the Tobago House of Assembly Act 40 of 1996, via the 5th schedule, is responsible for all matters relating to social welfare, and whereas the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 resulted in stay-at-home measures, and whereas there has been an alarming increase in incidents of domestic violence and child abuse directly affecting men, women, and children. Be it resolved that this House joins in condemnation of these heinous acts of violence and abuse meted out to citizens throughout the country. And be it further resolved that this THA Executive Council continue to support the work of our social support staff within the THA and the larger Tobago community, including NGOs and CBOs, in managing these issues. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. The amended motion is carried. Leader of Assembly Business.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. I now beg to move that this House stands adjourned for a date to be fixed.
Honorable members, the question is that this House now stands adjourned for a date to be fixed. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. This House now stands adjourned for a date to be fixed. President, good afternoon.